Listen up, weed lovers. It's 420 month, and IndieCloud.co is here to elevate your celebration. Get a massive 42% off all weed, edibles, and vapes for the entire month of April in our biggest sale of the year. This is a special year to celebrate 420, as it marks 6 years since the sale of almost all cannabis products was legalized across the country. This allows IndieCloud to deliver to you dispensary-grade legal products discreetly delivered straight to your door. No medical card needed. IndieCloud has something for everyone. Whether you're a seasoned toker or just starting out, you can explore the world of weed safely with our award-winning Soda Shop Gummy Series, our 12 strains of flower, or our record-breaking selection of vapes. Celebrate 420 responsibly all April with IndieCloud. Discreet delivery, top-shelf products, all month long. Head over to indiecloud.co/spring24, that's C-O, not .com, to snag 42% off your first order.
Unfortunately, people go missing in our national parks all the time. Some just get lost, but others disappear under very mysterious circumstances. Follow me down the rabbit hole about missing 411. Hello, friends. Welcome back to the rabbit hole. I'm your host, Danny, and today I am sick. So I apologize for my voice. I have some tea here to help me get through the recording, and hopefully next week I won't sound like this. Thank you, Case, for sending this in. Missing 411, when I first read it, I was like missing 411 people? No. 411 meaning like information. So there's about 1,200 or so cases that fit the profile of these weird, mysterious circumstances. And if you guys saw my Instagram post, you saw that I have a lot of requests. So if you guys are going to send me a request, I now have a Google form for it so I don't lose anything. So go through my Instagram to the link in my bio. It's a link tree. The very first link through that link tree is a request form to request an episode. That's the only way I'm going to be accepting requests from here on out. You guys can still send me things in Instagram videos and things like that. Totally fine, but I will not accept your requests through that. You have to send them through that Google form just to keep my sanity. So I appreciate all the requests and I want to do every single episode, so keep sending them in. So missing 411 really starts with David Pilatus. He is a former police officer who turned into an investigator, and he has published books on Bigfoot and is the founder of the Missing 411 conspiracy theory. There are about 8 books in the Missing 411 series, and there's documentaries that talk about these cases of the people that have gone missing in like national parks and other places as well. But these are like super unusual cases. He started his research into these disappearances after he was approached by 2 park rangers while he was visiting a national park who knew he was an author and wanted him to look into these stories because they knew something weird was going on. So he has found, like I said, 1,200 cases that fit the profile of weird and unusual disappearances. I'm going to tell you a few stories from his books and movies, and they're pretty weird, which actually got me really intrigued. But unfortunately, most of them don't have a conclusion. So you guys have to tell me what you think is happening in our parks. But to qualify as one of these cases, they have to hit several of the profile points. And I don't know exactly how many profile points they have to hit, but they do have to hit a certain amount of them. They came up with these profile points after extensive research into different stories and seeing these points come up repeatedly. And like I said, not every case checks every single box, but these are what they're looking for. So the first one is a point of separation. This means that if the victim is with other people, at some point they're going to move away from those other people for whatever reason, and that's when something is going to happen and they're going to disappear. The time of disappearance. So typically people are going to disappear in the mid to late afternoon or early evening time frame. Oftentimes we find that victims are disappearing around boulder fields, so granite or rock fields, which I actually noticed this before I knew it was like a profile point. I was like, wow, they're all like really close to boulder fields. I thought it was weird, and then it was a profile point, and I was like, oh, yep, that tracks. Typically, they're near water of some sort, like a creek, a river, a lake, something. There is typically a weather event that happens right around the time of the disappearance. So either when the victim disappears or when the search starts. And this could be anything from like a dust storm, a rainstorm, a blizzard, anything. Victims will have a disability or an illness. Sometimes these can be pretty obvious or maybe not so obvious. I also noticed this before I knew about the profile points. Seems odd that that would be one of them, but it happens often. Typically, when dogs are brought in to do the search and rescue efforts, which in almost every single case they can't find a scent or they'll lose the scent super fast. And this happens in 95% of cases. This is the one profile point that happens the most frequent. And if the person is found, they are found in a place that's been previously searched. And like search and rescue does a really good job of searching. Like that's literally their entire job. But for some weird reason, the victims are found in an area that had been searched. Sometimes this area has been searched multiple times, almost as if the victims were put there after the area was searched. Or if we don't find the actual person, then we'll find like their clothing or some of their belongings that weren't there when we searched and now they're there now. Missing clothing is another profile point. So they're missing clothes, shoes at the time that they're found, or we find their clothes or shoes or both, but not the person. For some weird reason, they're taking clothes off or leaving clothes behind. Usually they have an unknown cause of death. We have no idea how they died. They'll have signs or like they'll look like they died from something, but they don't actually have physical evidence saying that that's what happened. And then they happen in geographical clusters. So this means that multiple victims that fit the missing 411 profile are found in similar geographical areas. For example, there are multiple victims that are found in the northern Colorado mountains in or around like Rocky Mountain National Park. So these clusters can be anywhere from 3 to 70 or 80 disappearances in that area. Not all at the same time, like over a time span, but they don't count unless there's at least 3 weird disappearances in the area. And there are 59 clusters around the US and Canada. So it's happening a lot. But there are also 4 factors that exclude cases from missing 411. So that is mental illness, voluntary disappearance, criminal activity, or signs of an animal attack. So the very first thing they look for when they get out there is an animal attack or any signs that it was an animal attack, because that makes sense that potentially if you're in a national park that an animal would try to eat you, especially if you're a toddler or like a small child. You might go missing because an animal's going to attack you and try to eat you. But if they see any signs of that, you don't qualify. So keep that in mind when we're going through these cases. And also, before we get into these stories, it's important to know that the FBI doesn't investigate missing persons cases. They just don't do it. There is a group of the FBI that can become involved in a disappearance of extremely young children under a certain set of criteria, right? But typically, they don't get involved. These criteria, mostly like abductions. So if a child is abducted and they could potentially have crossed state lines, then the FBI is going to get involved. But if somebody's just missing, they're not getting involved. And also, I took just some stories. There's so many stories. Like I said, I did not cover all the stories. If you want to, you can go to my show notes and follow that rabbit hole down. I am covering stories of like hunters because hunters are pretty good outdoorsmen, and also children because the children cases are really strange as well. So there are plenty of cases that fit into this. I'm just covering a few of them. Let's start with the hunters because like I said, they're very good outdoorsmen. They typically have a like good situational awareness. They're pretty knowledgeable about like where they're at. They don't typically go hunting where they haven't gone hunting before. However, you do see that. Like, they gotta start somewhere, right? But the last person you think would vanish would be a hunter. So let's start with Thomas Messick. He was an 82-year-old man who had been hunting his entire life. He had 3 boys, and he raised them also hunting and fishing because that was his favorite pastime. His wife said that they would go camping all the time growing up. He had family friends that were also interviewed in the documentary I watched, and they all went camping and hunting together. So that was like his favorite thing to do. He had taught hunter training for many years just because that's his thing, you know? And he was an airborne ranger when he was a young buck. So that tells you that he has some pretty good training out in the field being military. And he knew what he was doing in the woods, basically, is what I'm trying to get at. That way, like, you know that this is a weird story. He had a missing right eye after he had like a gunpowder incident, and that incident also left him hard of hearing in one of his ears. So he had a disability. Check. He went missing in Northeast New York on November 15th, 2015. And actually, a lot of these stories are from 2015, which I thought was interesting. That must have been when Paulides started his research, and he kind of started with the newest and like worked his way backwards. But the day he went missing, he was on a camping hunting trip with 6 other guys. So his son Rob and his longtime friend and hunting partner Sid were like a couple of the guys that were on this trip with him. They would go up to the same camping spot every single year for about a week to hunt and fish. It seemed like 4 families owned this cabin, and I think that he and his friend Sid were 2 of the 4 families that owned this cabin. And typically they would just hunt straight from the cabin, but this time they decided that they wanted to go to a new place to hunt. So they went up Lily Pond Road to Lily Pond. And Lily Pond is like it's the dead end. So there's no, there's the pond at the end of the road, nowhere else to go. So the way they were hunting that day is they were doing like this drive and hunt type thing where basically you had the older men and they would post up like 100 yards away from each other. And they started at the pond and worked down the road. And then they would go about 30 or 40 yards into the woods and just sit there. And the younger guys hiked up the trail and went around to the top of the mountain. And they were going to drive any wildlife down towards the older guys to then shoot. Tom was the furthest one down the road. So he walked the furthest down the road away from the pond, and he posted up down there and just kind of waited. And they were called the Watchers. Everyone had a walkie-talkie, so Tom had a walkie-talkie with him, and he had a rifle, about 3 or 4 bullets, and a snack. When interviewing Sid, Tom's friend, he was asked if he saw any deer. Sid said no. Then he was asked if he heard anything in the woods that day. Sid said he had heard a strange noise, something that he doesn't typically hear in the woods. He couldn't describe it for us. It was just something very odd that he had never heard before. And he said this noise was not coming from the direction of Tom. It was coming from the direction of up the mountain where the younger guys were kind of driving down the wildlife. So I don't know, just a weird thing. He said he estimated it about 150 yards away from him into the woods, not south down towards Tom. But they were up there for about 2 hours, which is what they planned on from the very beginning, because they didn't get up there until 3 in the afternoon. They were going to hunt there for a couple hours, then go back to the cabin and hunt from the cabin. So around 3 p.m., all the men gathered at the truck, but Tom did not. So that was weird. So they tried to reach him via radio, but didn't get anything in return. And then they went to look for him and couldn't find him anywhere, which was odd, right? So they started firing shots and yelling for him. One of them went to alert the rangers that he was missing. And that night, 3 of the men stayed up at the hunt site in the truck, and the other 3 went back down to the cabin. The men that were in the truck were honking the horn all night long as a way, if Tom did get lost, this would help him find his way back to them. The search began early the next morning, so on November 16th, and the New York Forest Rangers oversaw the search. And it was raining very heavily that day, which is your weather phenomenon, right? And it was noted that they nobody saw any wildlife while they were there. No squirrels, no chipmunks, no deer, no birds, literally nothing. Which is weird for woods that are hunted frequently, that there would be no animals. But they also didn't see any signs of Tom. They didn't see any signs of anything. So at some point they thought maybe he had gotten to the road and then maybe gotten hit by a car, but they didn't find anything on any of the roads, and they weren't near any busy roads. They were 2 miles up this dirt road and dead ended at a pond. If he had gone to any road, it would be a dirt road, and they were the only people on that dirt road. They had divers search the pond and the streams, the swamps, nothing. They had this huge turnout of searchers. They had 50 to 60 volunteer fire departments send people, the New York State Corrections and their dogs, the police, the park rangers, volunteer search and rescue teams and their dogs. They had helicopters. They had everything. They didn't find any of his clothes. They didn't find his walkie-talkie, his rifle, literally nothing. And had an animal gotten to him, they would have found traces of him, right? Like ripped clothes, blood, his gun. Like an animal's not going to eat his gun. But they didn't find anything. Strangely enough, on the 4th day of the search, 2 FBI agents showed up, and if you don't remember, they don't do missing persons cases. And the only time they would get involved is for young children. This guy's 82 years old, and he's missing. He's not dead, or at least not considered dead. But the FBI talked to Tom's wife and told her that he is officially a missing person and something just like wasn't right about the situation. But until they had made a recovery, they just wouldn't know what it was. So the agents started monitoring the incident. And what that means is that they're taking notes on what's going on and they're sending their reports back to Virginia. And they're trying to match other cases to this case. Coincidentally enough, there are reports from the FBI monitoring similar cases dating all the way back to the 1960s. Tom Messick's formal search came to an end on November 26th, and there's still no trace of Tom or any of his belongings or anything. But just a few days after Tom went missing, 40 miles south in Schuylerville, New York, Fred Drum went missing. So Drum was a 68-year-old man, and he went missing on November 24th. He was also an outdoorsman, and he lived on a farm in rural New York. He went missing from his farm on Thanksgiving Day. So Mrs. Drum had left the farm to go attend a banquet, and when she returned, Fred was just gone. His car was still there. All his belongings were there. Like, it was as if he was still there, because, like, his keys, his wallet, nothing that he would have taken with him was missing. His phone, but Fred was just gone. So the New York Forest Rangers were pulled from the Messick case and sent to the Drum residence to start searching for him. And as with Tom, they had the helicopters, canine units, SAR, the whole 9 yards, everything. And unfortunately, Fred's case ended just like Tom's case with no sign of him, and he's never been found. That's very odd. But like I said, there are clusters all over the U.S. So there's a Santa Fe cluster, and in the Hunted, Missing 411, the Hunted episode or documentary that I watched, they went over these 3 cases. There are 15 people that meet the criteria in the Santa Fe area that are in the Santa Fe cluster. More specifically, the Santa Fe National Forest. There are 3 of the 15 disappearances that stand out the most. So these are those 3 stories. So the first one is on July 30th, 2014, Audrey Kaplan disappeared. She was 75 years old, and she was from Santa Fe, but that day, her and her husband decided to go up to the ski resort to look for mushrooms, because it was July, so the ski resort, there's no skiing.
Listen up, weed lovers. It's 420 month, and IndieCloud.co is here to elevate your celebration. Get a massive 42% off all weed, edibles, and vapes for the entire month of April in our biggest sale of the year. This is a special year to celebrate 420, as it marks 6 years since the sale of almost all cannabis products was legalized across the country. This allows IndieCloud to deliver to you dispensary-grade legal products discreetly delivered straight to your door. No medical card needed. IndieCloud has something for everyone. Whether you're a seasoned toker or just starting out, you can explore the world of weed safely with our award-winning Soda Shop Gummy Series, our 12 strains of flower, or our record-breaking selection of vapes. Celebrate 420 responsibly all April with IndieCloud. Discreet delivery, top-shelf products, all month long. Head over to indiecloud.co/spring24, that's CO, not .com, to snag 42% off your first order. Summer is the season of hot temperatures, outdoor adventures, and refreshing water activities. Summer is also the season of rough on your feet, causing dry, cracked heels and toes. Introducing Babyfoot, the original exfoliation foot peel that contains 16 natural extracts formulated to remove dead skin cells in 3 easy steps. Apply the booties, relax for an hour, then wash your feet. In 14 days, you've got baby smooth skin and your feet have never been softer. Letting dead skin cells build up over time is hazardous to your foot health. Our professional grade DIY products, like our original exfoliation foot peel, our men's foot peel, or our moisturizing mask, are some of the best foot care products on the market, created with your foot health in mind. Pamper yourself with a spa day from the comfort and convenience of your own home with Babyfoot. If you want a chemical-free, easy-to-use exfoliating process from the company that created the original foot peel, it's time to treat yourself to Babyfoot. Go to babyfoot.com and use the code SUMMERFEET24 and get 20% off your first order with Babyfoot. That's babyfoot.com and use the code SUMMERFEET24.
They were hiking up to the mushroom picking area, which I guess was just like a really popular mushroom area, and somehow they got separated. It's really unclear what happened. The same day that the search for her started, so they wasted no time at all. And this is one of the hottest months in Santa Fe, and there are scattered thunderstorms in the area, so there's some weather events. Days later, the searchers came across a campsite near a stream, and this was off the primary grid search area, so it's kind of off the beaten path a little bit. The campsite seemed pretty destroyed, though. Like, somebody was there but hadn't been there in a while. And then the searcher also saw a woman naked in the fetal position in the water, because this campsite was near a stream, like I said. So there were no shoes, no clothes, like literally nothing near her. And this was the 5th day of searching for Audrey. The coroner's report said, quote, although there are no specific autopsy findings to indicate hypothermia, the circumstances of Miss Kaplan's death and lack of fatal disease at autopsy support cold exposure due to very low temperature at night, end quote. So I was like, okay, that's weird. So I looked it up, and in July in Santa Fe, the temperature is typically in the 50s, like average between like 53 and 55 degrees. This is the warmest month of for night temperatures in Santa Fe, because it starts to kind of dip back down in August. However, it is possible to get hypothermia in 40-degree weather, and even more likely if exposure to rain or submerged in cold water or something like that, which were both true for Audrey Kaplan, because remember, there were scattered rain showers and she was in the water. But it's weird that the report says that there's no evidence of hypothermia, but that she died of cold exposure due to low temperatures. The coroner also states that there is no evidence of drowning, but the crime scene photos show her face fully in the creek. But she had no injuries that he could note. So her cause of death isn't unknown. It's basically cold exposure, but it doesn't make a whole lot of sense because there's no evidence to support the cold exposure cause of death. The next disappearance in the Santa Fe cluster is Mel Nadell. He was in the National Forest elk hunting, and he went missing on September 6th of 2009 at the age of 61. Again, he's a hunter, right? So you think that he would be in the wilderness, like he knows what he's doing up there. He's been up here to elk hunt before. He got to Elk Mountain around 4 p.m., and he was going up to meet like a couple work friends to go elk hunting. He did have a knee injury from stepping in a gopher hole a couple days prior, so that might have been why he decided to kind of stay closer to camp. So he decided to only go like 100, 150 yards away, while his buddies decided to hike up toward the peak of the mountain to go hunting. But also, Mel's wife said that he didn't really like to walk, so that might have been a reason that he didn't want to hike. I don't know. Either way, dude didn't go with his friends. So that's that separation, right? He's by himself. Friends went on. When the two friends returned, Mel's Jeep was still there, but Mel just wasn't. And this was just after dark, so you would think that Mel would have returned by then because he's not that far, or he would have at least heard his friends coming back and he would have returned back to the camp. They started doing what the men in Tom's story were doing. So they started yelling for him and shooting their guns to try to get his attention and give him a reference point so he knew where to go back to. The idea here was that he might have shot an elk and then followed it to go retrieve his elk, right? And maybe he got lost at that point. But the weird thing is, when the dogs came out to help search for Mel, they tracked his scent to this tree where he had made this makeshift blind, but not any further. So if he had left his tree to go recover an elk, which makes total sense if you're out elk hunting, then the dogs would have traced his scent further all the way to whatever elk, but they lost his scent at the tree. They never found Mel. They never found any of his items, not the bow. He had a gun with him. Nothing that he had with him. They didn't find anything. If he was attacked by an animal, again, we would have found clothing. We would have found something, blood probably. The search for him lasted about 6 days. I think that basically after a few days, they don't think that they could find people, so they just stop the search and they put their resources elsewhere. Because we see that in most of these cases, after up to a week, they kind of stop the search after that. The last of the 3 disappearances that we're going to talk about in the Santa Fe cluster is Stanley Vigil. He went missing on November 7th, 2017 at the age of 54. So he was only about 10 miles from where Mel disappeared, up in the same mountain range, same area. He was with his dad and a friend, and they were out hunting for deer. And they found one. A deer crossed in front, like literally right in front of their vehicle. So Stanley jumped out with his rifle to chase the deer down, which, like, I've never gone hunting. I don't know if that's proper hunting procedure. Feels like strange. But just as he was chasing the deer, like, fog and heavy rain came through at the same time, and Stanley was just gone. They started to look for him basically right away. They looked for him for 7 days. They had the crews on the ground with dogs that the dogs could not pick up his scent. They had helicopters in the air. They just, like, did not see him. And they didn't find any tracks or anything left by Stanley. I'm not sure if they found tracks left by the deer. I would be interested to know that. Like, if they could find deer tracks but just not Stanley's tracks. That's odd. But about 5 months later, an off-duty police officer and his son were on the Pecos River fishing. And they found Stanley. This was April 7th, 2018. He was 9 miles away from where he had jumped out of the car. Which, okay, possible that you could hike for 9 miles because you're trying to find something. Like, trying to find the car, trying to find a trail, trying to find something. I get that. He did have some skull injuries. He had 2 broken bones, and it is assumed that he drowned in the river. But that's just 3 of the 15 people in that cluster. And guys, there's 59 huge clusters around America and Canada. We're going to talk about the Crazy Mountain Range in Montana. So this mountain range, I didn't know this, so I'm going to share some information with you. It is not part of the Rocky Mountain Range, and it is the youngest mountain range in all of North America. So they're like their own little set of mountains. And I'm only going to tell you one story from this mountain range. So this is the story of Aaron Hedges. And this story is just so wild. So he went missing September 5th, 2014 at the age of 38 in the Crazy Mountain Range. So there is this tale about the Crazies, which is what they call them there, that the land used to belong to the Crow Indians. And when their land was taken from them, they put a curse on the mountains for the wind to blow and drive the white man crazy. So the locals think that maybe this was just the old curse. But maybe that's just old wives' tale. Who knows? Aaron was going on a pack-in elk hunt with his 2 friends, and he was a good hunter. He hunted the Crazies often. His friend actually said that he was up there hunting basically every other weekend, so he knew the whole area very well. They had 2 horses and a mule with them, and they're gonna be gone for a week, camping up near a lake. There were a couple different lakes. I should have named them, but I did not. So Aaron walked into the camp while on like the way up to the camp, the mule spooked and was bucking, and most of Aaron's camping stuff was being carried by the mule, which makes sense. It makes sense to have a mule if you're gonna go hunting, because then if you shoot an elk, the mule can carry it out. But anyway, so the mule was bucking, and because it was doing this crazy movement, it had lost a lot of the stuff that it was carrying. So among those things, Aaron lost his sleeping bag. There was other things that were lost as well. I don't know, like, obviously they were lost enough that they couldn't recover these things. But luckily for Aaron, one of his friends had like a cache near another lake that was not too far from the lake that they were camping at. So Aaron decided to like hike up the trail to the next lake to the cache to get some things. This was a couple days after. So he was up there for a couple days and then was like, okay, I really do need like my sleeping bag and all these things that I lost. So I'm going to go up to this cache that my friend has and I'm going to get what I need and I'll come back. He left the camp on the morning of the 5th around 10 a.m. And in the afternoon, one of the friends radioed him to find out where he was, just to like kind of check in with him. And the radios they were using also gave GPS data of the person they were talking to. So when you radioed them, you could look at the screen and see where they were at. And then like the person that was receiving the radio could look on the screen and see where the other person was at. So that way you always had eyes on each other. But what was really weird is when they radioed him, the GPS data showed that he was like in the opposite direction of the cache and of the lake that he was supposed to be going to. So basically he was hiking up this trail and the trail would come to a fork in the road. He needed to take the fork to the left, up a little bit further to the next lake, and he knew that, and it was well signed. Everything was very well laid out. And again, he has been up here hunting every other weekend for I don't know how long, but it wasn't like trails you can't see. These trails are very defined. And instead, he took the trail and went to the right and just like kept going. So when they radioed him, he was on the very edge of their screen and just like walking in the wrong direction. It was assumed. But he also didn't ever radio back. But again, he's familiar with the area, so the friends really didn't think much of it and didn't even realize that Aaron was missing until the next morning. And then they waited all day for him, and then they started to look for him the following day. So the 5th is the day he goes missing. The 6th, they just kind of like wait around. They're like, oh, he knows what he's doing. He'll make his way back here. The 7th is the day that they actually called search and rescue. And that was also the day that the storm rolled in, and it snowed somewhere between 18 and 24 inches in 12 hours. So it was quite the storm. But they hadn't called search and rescue until around 9 p.m. on the 7th. So yes, they called on the 7th, but not until like way late. So now the dude's been missing for like 2 days, 2.5 days, really. So they did have a cool like jumping off point because of the GPS data, but during the search, they didn't find any footprints or tracks or any trace of Aaron. They did, while they were searching, they did find his boots, and they were found the second day of searching, and this was like 4 days after he disappeared. It is of note that there were boulder fields on both sides of the trail, and the boots were found even further east than his GPS ping, so as if he was walking to the east instead of to the west where he should have been walking. And the boots seemed like they had been placed there purposely. It was like somebody walked into their house, took their boots off and placed them next to each other right there. It was like he sat down, he took his boots off and placed them right next to each other because they were side by side, just like perfectly there. So definitely not like he was running and they fell off. That's weird. Why would you take your boots off? But next to the boots was like a water bladder, like one that goes in a camelback. And that was all near like this fire pit. So in the fire pit was a partially burned cigarette container that was Aaron's brand of cigarettes. There was also the waist belts from the backpack in the fire pit. And the belts, these are the belts that go around your waist to kind of help more evenly distribute the weight. They had been cut off his backpack and then they were partially burned. But the fire pit itself, it looked like it was a small fire. It wasn't huge. But what was even more weird is that the searchers had been in that area where the boots were found just a couple days before. So I'm assuming that they were there the very first day of the search and they didn't see anything. There was no boots, there was nothing there. They didn't see anything until like that day that they found them. So then they started to think, okay, maybe it's hypothermia, because in the later stages of hypothermia, you start to think that you're super hot and you take items off. And I talked about this in the Dyatlov Pass episode because it was assumed there that they were hypothermic and they started taking their clothes off. So it's assumed that he was in the later stages of hypothermia, that he was getting hot, he started to take his clothes off, which is why they found the boots like that, and that if he was in the later stages of hypothermia, he could not get much further. So they really narrowed their search because they were like, dude's dying. We got to find him quick. But unfortunately, they never found Aaron, and the search for him came to an end on September 22nd, 2014. 9 months later, even further east than where his boots were, a local farmer found Aaron's backpack on his land. And in fact, it was leaning up against a tree as if it had been placed there, which was weird. But in his bag, there was his hunting license, so they knew who it belonged to, and everyone in the area had known that Aaron Hedges had gone missing. So they were like, "Oh, wow, we found this." He had his gun in there, he had some snack bars in there, like along with whatever else you would keep in a backpack. But this way they could identify him, and he would have had something to eat and something to signal with. They also found his bow laying right next to his bag. Again, another year passes, and they find remains of a human. And that ended up being to the north of where the backpack was found, but also in the vicinity was his cell phone, a jacket, but there were no pants or socks, and also no feet. Like, they found human remains, but they never found any feet bones, which is really, really strange. None of these things had been close together. So the boots and the backpack were found miles apart. The closest thing was the backpack and the human remains. The remains were found 11 air miles from where he was last seen on GPS data. But of course, you're not going as the crow flies. That's just impossible. Like, you can do it in a helicopter because you can fly over the mountains and whatever, but you're going to follow a trail. But the remains were also found 6 miles from where the boots were found. So he was walking for 6 miles barefoot in 18 to 24 inches of snow. That's weird. That's really strange. Then they didn't find socks or feet. They didn't even find his feet. So at what point did his feet fall off? The cause of death for Aaron is unknown. They have no idea why or how he died. But it's just really weird because he could see the creek the whole time. So he could have drank. He could have followed the creek down the mountain to get to the local town. He had a lighter with him, so he could have made a fire. He had food, so he could have eaten. He had his gun. He could have signaled for help. He had his GPS radio, so he could have called his friends or looked like at where he was compared to where they were, or like just looked where he was on the map, so that way he could try to figure out like how to get back to his friends, how to get back to somewhere that he knew. And yet he did none of those things. An experienced hunter who has been in these mountains time and time again, just that it's weird. This is like a very strange case to me. I just don't understand it. But now we're going to get into the missing kids because I don't know. These are some strange cases as well. So first we're going to go over Dior Coons Jr. He went missing July 10th of 2015 in the Salmon Chalice National Forest just outside of Leadore, Idaho. He was only 2 years old when he went missing. And his parents, his great-grandpa, and a family friend, so grandpa's friend, were all at the campsite with Dior the day that he went missing. So the morning of the 10th, Dior's parents needed to run into town to get some things, and so they took him with him, obviously, and they got back around like noon-ish to the campsite. When they got back, Grandpa and his friend had shown like Dior's parents all the fish that they had caught, and so the parents were like, okay, show us where you caught this fish. Like, I don't believe that you caught all these fish in this tiny little creek over here. So the family friend took the parents and they walked to the creek. Well, Dior, the little Dior Jr., he followed along. He was going to follow mom and dad, but about halfway there, he decided, nope, I want to go back and be with Grandpa and eat my candy, because they had gotten him some candy while they were in town earlier, which is like totally typical for a 2-year-old, right? So mom, dad, and friend are down at the creek for like 10-15 minutes before they return up to the campsite. And it's not far. They're like 50 yards from the campsite, so they're not that far. And they were like, okay, cool. Like, where is Dior? They asked Grandpa. And Grandpa said, oh, he's right there. And he turned and Dior was gone. The family, of course, like immediately starts looking for him because they're like, what the heck happened to our toddler? And they look for him for about an hour before they call the police. So mom gets one bar on her phone, so she calls from the campsite, but dad was like, no way, that's not enough. I'm gonna run down the road. He jumps in his truck, starts driving as fast as he can down the road to call the police to get search and rescue out there. And they do. They get out there pretty quick. An abduction was ruled out because the campsite was the dead end of a dirt road. There was nothing else and it had somebody else shown up, like they would have all known about it because you would have heard the car roll. It's a dirt road, it's a rocky road. You would have heard a car roll up. You would have seen somebody else. Like they got there the night before. They were the only people in the area. They did suspect the parents, but honestly, there was just no signs of foul play here. When the search and rescue teams got there, they had their dogs with them, they had helicopters, they had ground workers, they had so many people. These ground workers, they went through the creek on their hands and knees because what if he went to the creek and he drowned? You know, like what if he wandered off and he fell in? But they literally didn't find anything. They were in there on their hands and knees. They went through wolf dens, they went through bear dens, they looked in eagles' nests because I did not know this, but eagles can carry up to 30 pounds. So maybe like an eagle would have swooped down and carried him away. He was only 27, 28 pounds, which honestly is terrifying because my child is not 30 pounds yet. Neither of my children are 30 pounds yet, so they could easily be scooped up by an eagle. But there was no sign that he was in any of the animal dens or eagle's nests or nothing. About an hour or so after he went missing, there was a quick rain shower, but like nothing crazy. And just up the mountain from the campsite was a boulder field. So we're checking off profile points here. So the FBI actually called the local police department to offer their help about a month after Dior went missing. If you remember, at the beginning of the episode, I said that the FBI doesn't do missing person cases. But if it's an abduction, then, and like it's a young child, so they could have made an exception for him because what if he was abducted and he was taken across state lines, then the FBI would be involved and it would be an FBI case instead of a local case. But there was no evidence of that. And the police department asked the FBI to do the forensics because they're like, hey, what can we do? And they're like, hey, we're small, do the forensics. However, after looking into the disappearance, they told the sheriff's department that there was no indication that a crime had occurred, like at all, and they wouldn't be taking on the case. Of course, like the local people think that mom and dad killed him. There's not really any indication of that. There's no blood, there's no body, there's no nothing. I don't know, and I would be interested in asking this question, is if the dogs picked up a scent or not. Because that was never confirmed, and I am very curious about that. But they never found him. I still don't think they found him. The next story is of Bobby Bizup. He disappeared in the Rocky Mountain National Park just outside of Estes Park on August 15th, 1958. Bobby was 10 years old and he was partially deaf, so he wore a hearing aid. And he was attending a boys' camp called Camp St. Malo, which was a Catholic camp. And so there was lots of kids attending the camp, and they would do things that you would imagine a summer camp would do. So they would like play games, they would hike, they would sing, they would learn about God because it was a Catholic camp. But they kind of just like hung out and just had a good time, you know? Bobby liked to fish, so he was fishing in a small creek behind the retreat when, like, on August 15th, the day he went missing. Around 6 p.m., a camp counselor approached him and told him, hey, dude, time for dinner, let's go back. That's probably not what he said, actually, because I don't think in the 50s they said dude. But you can, like, put it in their slang. Let's go back to the camp and eat dinner. So Bobby acknowledged the counselor, and he cleans up really fast, starts to follow the counselor down the mountain, which was not far, to the retreat. But as the counselor was walking, he turned around, checked to make sure Bobby was following him, and Bobby was just gone. And that's, he started looking right away. Within 4 days, there was 400 people searching for him, but it was confusing as to how he would have gotten lost in the first place, because it's literally a straight downhill on a very defined path to the retreat, and he was following a counselor. So it didn't really make sense, where would he have gone? So the searchers actually dropped pamphlets all over the mountainside telling Bobby that his parents loved him and that they needed him home, which I found really interesting because I had never heard of that tactic before. So I guess they were assuming that he ran away at that point, that he didn't want to go back for dinner, he wanted to keep fishing, and then he was just hiding. I don't know what the thought process was, but I've never heard of that tactic where they're just dropping pamphlets, hoping that he gets one and comes back. They did find an ice cream carton that he used as a bait box about a mile away from the retreat. But after 9 days, the formal search was called off, and his parents were quoted in the local newspaper saying that they had given up hope and they basically thought that he wouldn't be found. But the whole time that they were searching, there were 3 counselors that never stopped searching for Bobby. Those 3 counselors returned the next year to counsel and do the same summer camp thing again. So they were out for a hike on the side of Mount Meeker, which this camp and like the retreat and the church, they're all at the base of Mount Meeker. They found in a boulder field a hearing aid and bits of clothing, and right there in the same area is where they found Bobby's remains. They had searched this area, this boulder field, 3 times the year prior and found nothing. And it wasn't like super hidden. It wasn't like you had to like move boulders to find it. It was just like on top of a rock was his hearing aid. Right next to this boulder was his clothing. And then right around the corner from that was his remains. Like it was all right there. You did not have to search hard. But again, there's just no way that he got lost. Literally, to the camp was like an easy trek just down the trail, right? And he was following a counselor. Where he was found, like, it was incredibly hard. Like, you had to scramble up this boulder field to get to where he was found, where his remains were. It's unclear how he died, or what was the cause of death, or even how he got there. It just leaves you with a lot more questions. But the last story I have for you is Keith Parkins. He disappeared on April 10th, 1952 in Ritter, Oregon. He was also only 2 years old. And because of the time of year it was, there was still like patches of snow on the ground. And his family, so his parents and his 2 brothers, they were visiting his grandparents in Ritter. And his grandparents were ranchers. So Keith and his brothers were out in the barn looking at these new calves that were born because they don't typically get to come and see the cows, and they only when they visit Grandma and Grandpa's house. But it was lunchtime, so Mom called to the boys to come in for lunch, and the 2 older brothers came right in, but Keith didn't. And the brothers reported that Keith had gone around the barn the other way, and so Mom went out to like find him, but he wasn't there. So the search for him started right away because she started looking around. They're like, okay, we got to find him right now. This was all before search and rescue was a thing, and so they just called a bunch of people in the area who knew how to search, and they just started doing it. They would go within like speaking distance of each other, so that way if they did find something, they didn't have to yell. They could just be like, hey, here's something, right? So about 200 people showed up, even in the 50s. Like that, I feel like you don't have any organized search and rescue. That's pretty good. And they searched all through the night. They did find tracks that Keith had left behind in a pasture along with cow tracks. As the crow flies, the distance from the house to where the tracks were found was 3 miles, but it's pretty rugged terrain, so it's more than 3 miles on foot, right? Like all these things, it's as the crow flies, that's how the distance. There's just no way that you're getting there in 3 miles. Fortunately, in this case, Keith was found alive. His body was found 5 miles away from his tracks. Again, that's a straight shot, but actually hiking, it was more like 12 miles than 8 miles total. But what's odd is that his tracks were found like northeast of the house, but his body was found due west of his tracks. So if you go northeast of the house for 3 miles, that's where his tracks were found, and then you go straight west for 5 miles, that's where his body was found. He was found face down in the snow. His body was super stiff, and this was about 7 in the morning. So they had been searching for him for like 19-ish hours. He did have his hat and his coat with him, but they were beside him. He was not wearing them. Here's my question. How does a 2-year-old go hike through 12 miles of rough terrain in snow and be found about 19 hours later after he goes missing? Like, nothing about this makes sense. Like, he just hiked all night in the freezing cold temperatures? He just, like, kept on moving? That's odd. My toddler does not want to hike that long. And toddlers, they're fast, don't get me wrong, but they're not that fast. So if the mom had gone right out to look for him after his brothers had reported him going around the barn the wrong way, even if he had started to wander off, she would have seen him or heard him or something. Toddlers aren't quiet unless they are up to no good, and they're not that fat. Like, you would see him wandering off. And he walked all night in the freezing temperatures. I'm not buying it. And why didn't he put his coat and his like hat back on? Granted, my toddler cannot put his own coat and hat on, but also my toddler would not carry his coat and his hat for that long. Like, what 2-year-old would? Have you guys ever met a 2-year-old that carries their coat for more than 5 steps before they drop it or want you to carry it? He will carry his bottle, my toddler, but I don't know. This feels very odd to me. And these are just a few of the stories. There's so many more stories. Can-Am YouTube has just story on story on story. You can go to their website and they have so many stories. There are it's baffling what the heck is going on out there. Are they being taken? I have so many questions. I guess my thought initially was like aliens, right? Like somebody's abducting them and they're being put back down. But that doesn't have to be the answer. I've heard like skinwalkers. I've heard like feral people, just like other creatures that live out in the national parks. It's just, I don't know. There's not like really any logical answer. At one point during the Aaron Hedges case, I was like, what if he like slipped into an in-between and he's invisible to us, we're invisible to him, and we can only see the things that he puts down and leaves, which accounts for like the boots and accounts for the backpack later on. It accounts for these things that he hasn't. It doesn't actually make that much sense either, though, because why would he take off his boots and then still hike another like 11 miles or however long, 6 miles? Nothing that I could think of actually makes sense. I did reach out to David Paulides for an interview, but as of this recording, it looks like it's not going to happen, which is okay. I still urge you guys to go and read his books, watch the movies, watch the YouTubes. Something weird is going on in our national parks, and I would love to know what you guys think it is. So go to my Instagram. I'm going to post a little like question answer thing, and you guys can tell me what you think is happening to these people, because this is odd for sure. But of course, my friends, as always, until next week, stay skeptical, and I will see you all then. Hey friends, The Rabbit Hole is an independent podcast with everything you hear done by me, Danny Mercy. I appreciate all of your support. Please rate and review wherever you're listening. If you want to follow us on Instagram, it's at rabbit.holepodcast. And thank you, Zakar Balaha, for our awesome intro.